fast lane.
real fast lanes.
At least I was gonna drive like an old person.
You know, they were trying to get that ball past driving in the left lane and couldn't get it. What's his name down there? Rick Griffith got up and says, okay, so you understand this. He says, there's some guy driving 80 miles an hour in the left lane, and a guy who's driving 90 miles an hour, and he wants to go 90. Which one do you give the ticket to?
Well, it just, to me, what they need to do is they need to have teaching. When I'm on the interstate, you see so many people get in the left lane, slow down, and talk on the telephone. You're not supposed to be talking on the telephone. When you see state troopers drive by them on the inside and don't do anything about it, that's the problem.
Yeah. Good morning. Glad to see everybody here this morning. We're studying in 1 Peter, the second chapter. Last week, if you'll remember, we were talking about honoring the public officials and the kings and the queens and all the public officials. And we're going to kind of change the subject today, and we're going to talk about the duties of the servants to the masters, and talk a little bit about slavery and how, you know, the ones who are in bondage are supposed to behave in accordance with, you know, God's word, and how they're supposed to treat their masters and things along that line. There was a lot of interesting stuff written about this from the scholars and the commentators, especially the older commentators that, you know, lived in the 18th century and the 17th century when slavery was really a hot topic and a hot item. So I think there's a lot of good stuff that we can glean from our study today. Before we go any further, I'd like to Keith Davis, if you would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Kind Heavenly Father, we once again bow before thy throne. Thank you, Father, for the night of rest. Thank you, Father, for the one desire to be here, study from your word. We pray, David, as he brings bread of life unto us, we pray, Father, we be receptive of what we learn, and use it to be better servants with it. We thank you for your Son Jesus, and the love that he's shown you on the Calvary's cross. It's through his name we pray. Amen.
Do you guys hear something coming back through the speaker?
There's a little bit of
Humming?
back noise. Little humming.
I think the closer I get, the worse. There we go. Good job up there, Jeff. All right, so let's look at verse 18. We're going to be studying here about the masters and the slaves through verse 25. Verse 18 says, "Servants, be in subjection to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward." So the word that's used here for servant is a pretty common word that's used throughout the New Testament. And one thing I kind of learned from this first part here was there were several different words in the Greek that was used for servant. The word here is kind of one of the common ones that's used. It's used in Romans, the first chapter, Philippians, the first chapter, and Titus, the first chapter. And the word in the original text is doulos, which means slave. And here the servants is kind of in a milder term that's being used, which is oki, which is a more of a domestic servant or a household slave, in contrast to the type of slave that might work out in the field. These are the servants he's talking about here are ones who would have almost constant contact with the master, versus ones that might be out in the field, in the shops and things along that line, that really might not have as much contact with the master as the ones who were serving him on a intimately on a daily basis. So, it was well known in the church at that time that there was a lot of the Christians that were in different forms of slavery and different forms of bondage. So this instruction here is very significant and very important for these people. And the reason is kind of obvious. We talked last week about the freedom that Christians have, but slaves are not in a situation where they've got freedom. And the emphasis we made last week was all men being on an equal footing. Well, that's it. That's in Christianity, but the masters and the people back in that time didn't exactly see it that way. They didn't put the slaves on the same footing as they would the master. So it was important that that Peter explained to these people what their relationship needed to be with their masters and how that they needed to behave, because there was a grave danger that these considerations would prompt a disregard for the slave's obligations. So, I'm free in Christ. Why should I do what you tell me to do? Bad situation, and that could have been disastrous for the early church, and could have brought a whole lot of problems down on them from the earthly masters, and probably also from the government institutions and things like that, because the masters would be going to the government to try to get some type of relief on these people. So if you think about it, the institution of slavery is really opposed to everything that Christ had taught. But we read all the way through the Bible that slavery has been around for a long time, and as time went on, it had a tendency to go away, and it was a real sticky issue. And you look back at the history of the United States. We fought a war over slavery. It was such a contentious thing, and it was interesting when you read about the founding fathers when they were putting the Constitution together. Slavery was a big issue, and it had to be dealt with, or the Constitution wasn't going to go. So, what did they end up doing? Well, they just kind of pushed it forward and said, we'll deal with it later. Well, we did deal with it later. But, even today, as liberated as everybody, thinks that we are, there is still slavery going on in the world. And it hasn't gone away, and it doesn't make it right, but it's just a matter of that's the way that it is. And there are probably Christians today that are bond servants and slaves, and what we're talking about here in the first century is just as applicable today as it was to them back then. So it was a very difficult situation to reconcile this subject to these people who had spiritual liberty, but they didn't have physical liberty, and they were under bondage and they were under control. Now, obviously, some of the masters weren't that big of a problem, but some of the masters were a big problem. So, you had to, deal with a whole lot of different relationships. And what Peter is doing here is he is giving the general rules, and he realizes, and you can see here in the, at the very beginning, he's telling there's going to be good and gentle masters, and there are going to be ones that aren't quite so gentle and good.
Exactly, the word that, of course, you read out of King James version that was forward, but it means harsh.
Right.
Yeah, it's an old English term.
Well, it's one of I thought this was pretty interesting. If you look at the definition, froward means willful and disobedient. And here was the example, and I can't remember which one of I think this was maybe out of Clark. He says, here's an example of it. If your dog sits when you call her to come and runs away when you tell her to sit, you can say that she's froward. So it's a kind of an adverb that describes. And another one of the scholars said it's somebody who is difficult or right down ornery.
And you think about what a test for these, in many of these cases, probably younger Christians
the point of on this is that whether the master is good or whether the master is evil, the behavior is the same. And they, that's the consistency that they're looking for here. Comments about that verse?
I think that word in that first sentence there, with all fear, I think it means respect.
Right.
You know, you respect them, the good, the gentle, and the harsh.
Right.
You still have respect for your master.
Right.
You're not telling them, you know, you can be afraid of them or fear of them.
And I believe that's the same word that was used when we were talking about the public officials. Same, I think it was the same word there.
It's basically saying the same way you're God, you're them.
Right, right.
There were as many as 60 million, according to William Barclay, as many as 60 million people were slaves in the Roman Empire. And they were the doctors, they were the teachers, they were the actors, they were the people who did all the work,
Right.
you know. So you almost think the Romans need to respect them, but of course the roles were exchanged here.
And it's funny you mentioned doctor there, and I can't remember which one. It was an old movie, but there was a physician who was a slave of one of the people in the movie, the prominent people, and the guy was a doctor, but he was a slave also. That's an excellent
Yeah,
point
well,
there.
Ava came from Arkansas, and in Arkansas, one of her family's best friends was a black couple that worked on the farm.
Mhm.
But her father had been a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, can you imagine having your slave, somebody that potentially could hate you, cut on you?
All right, let's move on to verse 19. For this is acceptable if for conscience toward God a man endureth griefs, suffering, and wrongfully. So this refers back to what we were talking about, being obedient to the wicked and the oppressive type of master. And the word acceptable here is translated from the same word that means thanks or thank in the passage. So Luke uses this same term in Luke 6 and 32. And it says, and if ye love them that love you, what thank have ye? So, where the significant here is, if you don't need, reward or praise if you're doing something good, and they're doing the good should be the reward that, they need. If you're doing your job well, that's what you should do. You're not necessarily, have to be rewarded and praised for doing what you're supposed to be doing. So here in this passage, such is contemplated as being witnessed by the Father, being his eyes and proceeding from his hands. So these things are coming from God, and the term is descriptive of the credit which belongs to those who exceed what might ordinarily be expected. If the master is treating you good, and you're happy with everything, that's a different situation than somebody who's being treated bad, but still performs in an exemplary manner. There's where the praise should actually be. So slaves of the world represent and rebel, quite a bit. And nobody wants to be abused by their master who are in slavery. But the Christians, they need to suffer. Don't complain about it. Keep a good conscience, because that's what God wants them to do. So Peter is not to be understood as affirming here that the suffering itself is an occasion for condemnation, commendation from God. That's what God expects, because that's acceptable, and it's a thankworthy type of relationship there. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 20. For what glory is it if when ye sin and are buffeted for it, ye shall take it patiently? But if when ye do well and suffer for it, ye shall take it patiently. This is acceptable with God. So the glory here is not that which affords occasion for boasting, but is that impression which, is by worthy conduct is made on others. So in other words, you're not sitting there boasting about it. You're reflecting well on yourself, and you're reflecting well on God by doing the things that you're supposed to do, and by conducting yourselves in a proper manner. You will gain some respect for yourself, but also, God will be glorified by the way that you act. So the word here literally signifies renown, fame, praise earned by commendable achievement. So the praise really should go to the ones who are in a bad situation and do good, rather than the ones that are in a good situation and do good, because they have to put forth a lot more effort. So if they do something wrong and they suffer punishment as a result of that, that's not worthy of praise. The part that's worthy of praise is somebody who doesn't do anything wrong but still suffers the bad things at the hands of the master. Now the word buffet here means to strike with a fist, and here it's in what they call the present passive participle, and it means to be repeatedly pummeled and beat all the time. They just get, they're constantly being punished by these froward masters. They're just plain evil. They just like to beat people up, whether they, like to tell the grandkids sometimes, we'll give you a beating every day whether you need it or not.
Almost sadistic.
Yeah, they're sadistic about the thing. So, when the punishment is undeserved and is administered because of the wickedness of the master, the Christian slaves should endure it. They should endure it patiently, because they desire to do the duty of God, and God approves of the things that they're doing, and He will bless them for doing what they're supposed to be doing under bad situations. So this word acceptable here is similar to the one that we talked about back in verse 19. So when men endure treatment for conscience sake, they are exceeding that which their followers ordinary to under such circumstances, and are therefore regarded as thanksworthy in the sight of God, because they have gone above and beyond in doing the things that they're doing there. So the early Christians often found themselves in this occasion, and it's pretty tough to do, but they need to rejoice that they were able to put up with the severe persecution and the trials that they do, and they should feel good about their conduct. Any questions about that verse? Okay, let's look at verse 21. For hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that ye should follow his steps. So here in verses 18 through 20, it deals with the duty of the servants to continue to do well and to submit patiently to whatever trials that they have to bear. But here we are seeing an example that Peter is using, and the example is Christ. And I think it was probably pretty well known at that time, what Jesus suffered on the cross, and it was something that probably everybody in that time period had a real good understanding of, because probably a lot of them had actually seen crucifixions and how they were carried out, because the Romans, they didn't just do crucifixions in Jerusalem. They did it pretty much all over the place where they happened to be occupying, I guess is the word I'd want to use. So, he's giving in the example of Christ, to be Christ-like and to bear the problems that you're having and the suffering in the same manner that Christ did, because he is the example of how things need to be. And while primarily acceptable to Christian slaves, these words have a general application to all to all Christians when you have some type of tribulation, because everything is not rosy on every day. There's a lot of things that happen to people that other than getting beat up and whipped and things along that line, there's bad things that happen to people, and you have to stand there and you have to take it, and that's what act in a way that God would want us to act. So Paul talks a lot in his writings. The Christians are going to have to suffer persecution because of following Christ. So Peter is basically telling them the same thing, and of course he calls them the ones who were called, and even called to suffering, because he knew it was going to be inevitable that these things were going to happen. And he uses the example of Christianity being a calling. And when you have this calling, there are going to be inevitable trials that are going to test your character. So he says here, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. So this is a reminder that no matter how bad you have it, Christ had it a whole lot. He had it a whole lot worse than anything that we were going to have to endure. So if he could endure all the things that happened on the cross, then the servant should be able to endure the same type of suffering. So there's two ideas here that advanced. One of them is that Christ suffered, and hence the servants must likewise suffer. And second, in suffering, the Lord left an example for his disciples to imitate, and in enduring similar trials. And if you think about this, if the slaves were enduring these things, the example that they were setting, not only the glory that they would bring to God in the eyes of their masters, but they're also setting an example for other slaves on how that they should behave in a situation like that. So Christ becomes the copy of how the life should be led, and he needs to be the pattern for them. It's kind of also interesting to note that the word steps here is kind of a reference to the heel of the shoe or of a footprint. So the concept is that there's footprints in the sand, and you follow along those, you follow along the same lines, and it leads you to where you need to go. So the Lord is an example, and he in theory just kind of we follow in his footsteps, and it'll lead us to the conduct that we need to be doing to enter into heaven. Comments about that verse?
I don't, you hear people today in some background about defense by yourself. We're not saying that Christians can't defend themselves, but these people had no defense.
Right.
These were owned people.
Right.
So for Christians today, I think God expects you to defend yourself if you need to.
Right.
But
Well, and another part of it too, and I think it's kind of human nature. No matter how evil some people are, there comes a point where enough is enough. And if these people are doing what the master wants, and eventually he's going to say, okay, why am I beating these people? They're and why am I treating them bad? They're doing what I want them to do, and they let off a little bit. So there's a little bit of wisdom there, I think, also situation. Okay, let's look at verse 22, continuing the thought in verse 21. Who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. So, Jesus suffered for everybody on the cross, but he's pointing out here that Jesus didn't do anything wrong. he led a perfect life. There was no guile found in his mouth. So, he suffered unjustly also. And, we've talked lots of times, he didn't fight back. He didn't say a whole lot in the deal. So, that's a good example of, somebody who was absolutely unjustly treated, and would be a perfect example. The guile or deceit or deception could be found or there was no guile or deception, in the words of Jesus. Everything that he said in the face of his enemies all the way through his life was true, and there was no deceit. He loved everybody. He was not trying to deceive anybody, and he was sincere in the things that he did, and he was sincere all the way up to the end. But yet people were hostile against him. So, Peter also may have cited this prophecy of Isaiah as especially significant to slaves because the Messiah is designated by the prophet as a servant of Jehovah, one who is oppressed and one who is afflicted. We can read that in Isaiah 52 and 13 and Isaiah 53, 7 and 8. And there's other passages that talk about Jesus being sinless and Jesus being perfect. So he's alluding to the fact here that if somebody who unjustly is accused and unjustly suffers can behave in the proper manner, then that would be the example that they should be doing. Jesus didn't sin. He took everything, and in word and in deed he lived a perfect and sinless life, which obviously we're not going to be able to, and obviously those slaves were not going to be able to do, but that would be a goal or an example for them to be. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 23. Who when he was reviled not again, when he suffered threatened not, but committed himself to him that judges righteously. So, this goes back and talks about Christ back in verse 21. And the verb reviled are translated from the Greek imperfect, the force which is significantly that when the Lord was being constantly reviled, he did not retaliate by railing back at him, and he suffered the things pretty much without any type of comeback at all. When he was on trial, he said practically nothing in the whole deal. So there probably wasn't a person on earth that was wronged more than Jesus. Yet he did and followed the edicts that his Father wanted him to follow in heaven. And that's kind of what made him the perfect sacrifice.
Probably what Peter's alluding to, you can go back and read in Matthew 27, 13, 14, and it says that Pilate asked him, don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you? But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor.
That's what he's talking about. When he was on, that's what I was getting ready to kind of go here. He was there before the Sanhedrin, the superior court, and he didn't fight back on the deal. Okay, let's move on to verse 24. Whom his own self bare our sins in his body upon the tree, that ye having died unto sin might live unto righteousness, by whose stripes ye were healed. So in the verses immediately preceding, back in 21 through 23, the example of Christ as patient and uncomplaining sufferer under extreme provocation was brought forth, and the Christian slaves to whom Peter was particularly addressing the instruction, they were admonished, following in Jesus' footsteps, and having had the occasion to refer to the suffering and the death of Christ on the cross, and unwilling to pass from his monumentous theme when he was thus far had pictured the Lord merely as a martyr courageously suffering and dying for a cherished cause. Here he dwells on and considers his death in relation to the redemption of man. You know, he reminded them again of Jesus' death on the cross was for their redemption. And, you know, they needed to always keep that in the forefront. And he had pointed to the fact, basically, that Jesus suffered on the cross for you, and that you should be an example, or he should be an example, and you should do the things that you should do for the respect of the things that Jesus did. So, Jesus was the example that they needed to use. Okay, any questions about comments about that one? All right, let's move on to verse 25. For ye were going astray like sheep, but now are returned unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls. So the figure of sheep as representative of the people, confused, bewildered, and without a leader is kind of sometimes a common theme in the scriptures, you know, running around without some type of purpose. And we know that if a sheep doesn't have somebody who is guiding them, they'll just wander away from the fold. And when they do wander away from the fold, then they expose themselves to all the dangers of the wilderness and those types of things. So, you know, this is a fitting representation of those who have forsaken the right way and have gone astray. And obviously, you know, there was probably some of these slaves that, you know, were rebelling against their masters and stuff, and it was causing, you know, problems for the early church. And, you know, Peter's telling him here, you know, you're kind of like sheep, and now you need to return to the shepherd or the bishop of your soul, which obviously is Christ. And, you know, recall that, you know, this is allusion that the Lord used a lot in his public ministry, particularly in the parable of the good shepherd in John 10:1-16. And it says here that, you know, the word returned is in the aorist tense and thus indicates a single act and a definite occasion when they return. So that, you know, he wanted them to turn about right then and there and return to the things that, you know, that they should be doing. And the subject here is if they do this, then they're going to get the desired results, and they're going to, you know, conform to the way that Christ wants them to live. And thus these to whom Peter wrote, by their obedience to the gospel, were saved from the wandering life of a sheep and the dangers that went along that, and they were returned to the shepherd and the bishop of their soul. So the Lord here is presented under two different aspects. First, he's presented as a shepherd that, you know, that feeds and guides and protects his sheep, and also a bishop or overseer because he superintends, supervises, and directs their activities. So those whose duty it is to direct the affairs of the church are under, you know, they're responsible for feeding, guiding, and directing the work of the church. And they are bishops who oversee, you know, the work of Christ and make sure that it's done in a proper manner. So we know that Peter was an elder, you know, in the church, and we'll talk about that in the 5th chapter. And what he's doing here, he's presenting Christ as the chief shepherd, and there's perhaps significant in the fact that attention is drawn to Christ as a shepherd and bishop of their souls. And through these to whom Peter primarily wrote were in bondage in the flesh, and their souls, though, were subject to a higher nature, and their souls were free and answerable only to, you know, to God, the great shepherd. Comments about that verse? Okay, I'm not going to start the next chapter. We've got a couple extra minutes here. So we'll pick up next week with chapter 3. Appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.